Imagine a single piece of heavy parchment, sealed carefully in wax, that possessed more political power than the entire Roman army combined could ever bring to bear in a single day's march. When Mark Antony broke that imperial seal in March of 44 BC, he wasn't just reading aloud from a private document. He was pulling the pin on a political grenade with a delayed fuse, already burning through the heart of the Roman Republic. That single document turned Caesar's private wealth into a public weapon that ultimately burned the Republican government structure to the ground and replaced it with something the founders of Rome had spent 5 centuries trying to prevent: one-man rule. Here are the 5 powerful ways Caesar's last will and testament did what 23 knife wounds could not, by completing the work of killing the Republic from the inside out within 13 years of the funeral. The first chapter is the murderer's catastrophic miscalculation, and it shows exactly how blind the conspirators were to what came after the blood dried on the Senate floor. By the Ides of March in 44 BC, the Roman Republic had been in escalating constitutional crisis for close to 100 years, since the Gracchi brothers tried to redistribute land in the late 2nd century BC and were killed for the attempt in the Forum. The traditional republican system rested on carefully balanced annually elected magistrates, senatorial authority, and a complex web of unwritten legal conventions that distributed real power among the Roman aristocracy and prevented any single figure from accumulating monarchical authority. Associated with the ancient Etruscan kings, Rome had expelled in the legendary founding of 509 BC. Caesar held the dictatorship perpetua, dictator in perpetuity, a title with absolutely no precedent in republican constitutional tradition, alongside the consulship and tribunician power all stacked in a manner Roman law was never designed to accommodate in any combination across 5 centuries. The senatorial conspiracy that assassinated him was motivated by a genuine and deeply held old republican ideology, especially in figures like Marcus Junius Brutus, who could trace his ancestry directly back to Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the entire republican system itself, around 509 BC. The conspirators, around 60 senators led operationally by Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, believed that Caesar's removal would restore the normal day-to-day functioning of the Republic and return Rome to the ancient power structure that had worked for 5 centuries before recent stress. They had made what would prove to be a catastrophically naive miscalculation of public mood. They had planned the assassination meticulously down to the selection of knives, but they had given almost no serious operational thought to what would actually happen in the hours and days afterward in the city of Rome itself. The conspirators stabbed Caesar 23 times on the floor of the theater of Pompey's great meeting hall, since the regular Senate building was then under renovation. They then fled the city almost immediately with no designated political successor, no follow-up civic plan, and no agreement on what their political demands actually were in the hours after the lethal act in the Forum. The 2 most consequential figures in Rome in the immediate aftermath turned out to be Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's serving co-consul and most politically powerful loyal ally, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Lepidus commanded a battle-hardened Roman legion, encamped just outside Rome's walls at the very time of the funeral. The second chapter is the revelation of the will itself, which Mark Antony turned into one of the most consequential pieces of political theater in all of recorded Western history. Caesar's legal documents, including his last will, his official papers, and detailed records of all current government business, were held personally by his wife Calpurnia in the family residence. They were among the very first assets that Antony moved to secure in the chaotic political hours immediately following the assassination. This was a move of profound political significance that the entire conspiracy entirely failed to anticipate or even attempt to prevent in their operational planning on the morning of the assassination itself. Whoever physically controlled Caesar's will control the official narrative of what his final intentions actually were: the legitimate legal disposition of one of the largest private fortunes in the Roman world, and the legal authority to act publicly in Caesar's name during the unsettled transition period that followed any violent change of leadership. The will had been deposited, as was standard Roman practice for wills of the highest political and financial importance, with the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the goddess Vesta who maintained Rome's sacred fire and served among other duties as official custodians of important state and private documents of record. On March 19, 44 BC, 4 days after the assassination took place. The will was officially opened and read aloud in a private gathering of key political figures at Antony's own house in Rome. The full public presentation of the will's specific contents, however, was carefully orchestrated by Mark Antony at Caesar's funeral on March 20th, 44 BC, in the Forum Romanum, the civic and spiritual public heart of the entire city. Tens of thousands of Romans packed the Forum that day to mourn and to listen, while Antony delivered the funeral oration that was later immortalized in dramatically stylized form by Shakespeare in his famous play. The detailed provisions of the will were made fully public during this single public event for the entire city to hear and remember over the months that followed. The emotional impact was absolutely calculated and devastating to the political standing of the surviving conspirators in the city. Romans gathered in the Forum heard that the man they had just lost to political murder had, in his final legal testament, given every single Roman citizen 300 sestertii apiece. In practical terms, 300 sestertii represented roughly 3 to 4 full months of average income for an ordinary Roman laborer at the time. The sheer scale of the gesture translated Caesar's abstract popular image as a man of the common people into something tangible, deeply personal, and immediately actionable for every adult citizen in the city. The third chapter is the suburban gardens and the people's land, a bequest that translated the cash gift into a permanent public monument of popular memory. Among the most politically resonant provisions of Caesar's will, beyond the direct citizen cash payment, was his outright bequest of his private gardens, the Horti Caesaris, situated along the west bank of the Tiber River in the Trastevere district, to the Roman people as permanent public open space for their free use in perpetuity. These were not modest grounds in any sense. Caesar's Trastevere gardens were extensive, elaborately landscaped private urban estates of the kind that only the most obscenely wealthy members of Rome's senatorial aristocracy could possibly maintain across multiple generations of inherited wealth. The political significance of this particular gesture operated on multiple levels simultaneously in the densely populated Roman political imagination of the moment. First, it was a concrete, lasting transformation of elite private property into permanently accessible public space, a form of practical generosity that had no real precedent in the ordinary political behavior of Rome's traditional senatorial class over many centuries. Second, it communicated, with perfect rhetorical political clarity, the fundamental divide in Roman politics that Caesar had always personally represented. While the traditional senatorial aristocracy had consistently used their inherited wealth to reinforce exclusivity and rigid social hierarchy, Caesar used his wealth to expand the physical commons available to ordinary citizens. Third, and most devastatingly for the now publicly panicked conspirators, it meant that the very same men who had just physically murdered Caesar now appeared to the Roman people not as defenders of ancient liberty, but as destroyers of a generous benefactor who had quite literally willed his own private pleasure grounds over to the entire free city. The Horti Caesaris remained public grounds and became a place of genuine popular pilgrimage and informal political gathering in the months and years immediately following Caesar's violent death, their very existence serving as a daily visible, accessible, and tangible reminder of what Caesar had been and what had been done to him by the surviving assassins. The fourth chapter is the rise of the unexpected heir, the teenager who used the legal adoption clause to transform himself into the most powerful man in the Roman world inside 13 years. The single provision of Caesar's will that would have the most profound long-term consequences for the entire subsequent trajectory of Roman history was not the universal citizen payment or even the popular garden bequest. It was the clause that posthumously formally adopted Gaius Octavius as Caesar's legal son and named him as the primary heir to the bulk of the vast estate. This specific clause had been known in advance only to a small, intimate circle of Caesar's closest political confidants, but was entirely unknown to the wider political world, including, apparently, to all 60 or so of the senators who had conspired in the assassination plot. Gaius Octavius was only 18 years old at the time of the assassination, studying quietly in Apollonia on the Illyrian coast in earnest preparation for a planned large military campaign against Parthia alongside Caesar in the following season, and was not even present in Rome on the day of the murder. He was Caesar's great-nephew by blood, the biological son of Caesar's niece Aetia Balba Caesonia, and had been quietly identified by Caesar early on as a young man of exceptional personal capability. Nothing in his ordinary public profile at the time, however, would have marked him out to Roman political observers as a serious future contender for supreme personal power in the city or the empire. His formal transformation into Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, with the legal adoption clause changing both his family name and his entire political identity simultaneously, was effected legally by the posthumous adoption clause of the will, and the personal political impact of that transformation was immediate and quite extraordinary in the months that followed. What the will formally gave Octavian was not merely a powerful family name and an enormous private estate. It gave him the single most emotionally resonant political brand in the entire Roman world, the name Caesar, at the precise historical moment when that visible name had just been transformed by violent assassination and dramatic funeral oratory into the most politically charged personal identity in the entire republic. The will also formally gave him Caesar's enormous personal fortune, one of the largest private fortunes in the entire Roman world at that moment. This translated directly into his practical ability to pay standing legions, fund political alliances, distribute generous largesse to the Roman populace, and personally fulfill the universal cash payment that the will itself had just publicly promised to every Roman citizen. The fifth chapter is the death of the Republic itself, the formal end of the 500-year-old constitutional order that was replaced by one-man rule within 13 years of the funeral oration. The 13 years from Caesar's March assassination in 44 BC to Octavian's final military victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC represent the visible death throes of the Roman republican system as a functioning constitutional order, a period of near-continuous destructive civil war, political murder, and the formal dissolution of every traditional senatorial institution that had held the state together. Caesar's will was the literal spark that set this entire transformative period in active motion. But the deeper structural forces it powerfully unleashed were ones that political historians now recognize had been quietly building for the better part of a century before the Ides of March. The most fundamental of these underlying structural forces was the slow transformation of Roman political reality over the previous century. The Republic's governing institutions had been originally designed for a small city-state, not for a vast Mediterranean empire spanning 3 continents. The Roman Senate and its public elections had worked tolerably well when the citizen body was concentrated physically in a single urban center, and informal political participation was physically possible for those who needed to vote and to hold office in regular rotation among the wealthy. By the 1st century BC, Rome militarily controlled territories from Hispania in the west all the way to Syria and Egypt in the east, across an entire empire. Millions of citizens physically spread across a world far too large for the Republic's traditional participatory democratic mechanisms to function in any meaningful way to ordinary residents. Real effective political power had quietly migrated to whoever could command the practical loyalty of professional standing armies. Armies whose common soldiers owed their daily livelihoods, retirement land grants, and ultimate personal security not to the abstract Roman state, which had no functioning pension system at all, but to their individual commanding generals who paid them out of personal funds. Caesar's will formally accelerated this dangerous political dynamic by publicly demonstrating, one final time at enormous financial scale, that popular political legitimacy could be manufactured directly, bypassing the entire traditional Senate and its institutions, through the open distribution of personal wealth and the careful cultivation of popular emotional loyalty in the forum. When Octavian finally emerged triumphant from the long sequence of civil wars, formally dissolved the triumviral emergency powers, and officially established the Principate in 27 BC, receiving the honorific title Augustus from a grateful and absolutely exhausted Senate that had no realistic political alternative left. He was scrupulously careful to present his new political order as a formal restoration of the old republic, rather than as its outright abolition under military pressure. He held no official title of king, wore no crown, and surrounded his unprecedented personal authority with multiple layers of traditional republican terminology carefully preserved from the old constitution in every public speech. But the actual substantive nature of what he had personally created was the one-man personal rule that Caesar had been assassinated for openly attempting in his own lifetime. It was achieved finally, because a dead man's last will and testament had given an 18-year-old teenager the financial resources and the personal legitimacy to rebuild an entire empire on his adoptive father's surviving political and military foundations across 13 years of steady civil war. If the quiet political genius of Caesar's will is keeping you up at night right now, then the next video will dive into the strange afterlife of one specific Roman figure who should have inherited everything instead, and what his disappearance reveals about how the new imperial order quietly rewrote family law to match its own political convenience. That follow-up video will reveal the one blood relative the assassins deliberately overlooked in their own plot, and what happened to him inside 7 years of the funeral, beyond any ordinary historical record. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now so you absolutely do not miss the quiet constitutional innovation that transformed a dead man's private estate into the most durable government structure the Western world has ever known over the next 2,000 years.